This is the common image of the United Nations, a tense, gridlocked voting chamber where a single raised hand stops a resolution in its tracks. Yet at the exact same moment, thousands of miles away, the UN executes complex logistics, dropping massive pallets of aid over active conflict zones. This dashboard reflects the current operational scale: 193 member states, a $3.45 billion regular budget, and a staff of 44,000, managing 17 distinct sustainable development goals. Despite coordinating this level of funding and personnel, the UN holds no territory and possesses no sovereign authority over its members. It cannot enforce a single decision without the explicit consent of the world's major powers. Critics typically view the institution's inability to stop conflict as a failure, a fundamental flaw that renders the organization irrelevant in times of crisis. But the gridlock caused by the veto is actually a design feature meticulously engineered into the system from the very beginning. To understand how the UN coordinates billions in aid while failing to stop wars, we have to reverse engineer its 1945 architectural blueprint. The United Nations functions as a decentralized ecosystem that has evolved over 8 decades to route around its own intentional design limitations. The previous attempt at global order, the League of Nations, collapsed because it lacked military teeth and failed to secure the participation of the world's most powerful states. In 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met at the Yalta Conference to decide on compromises required to ensure a new global architecture would actually survive. The resulting UN Charter established a dual-track system, offering universal, equal representation to all states on one side, while concentrating enforcement power on the other. Universal representation is found here, in the General Assembly, where every state has exactly one equal vote, regardless of its GDP or military size. But the Security Council is where the power resides. The 5 permanent members, the US, UK, France, Russia, and China, were granted the right to veto any substantive resolution. This veto has been used over 300 times to protect national interests, effectively freezing the Council during some of the world's most violent conflicts. This was the mandatory price of entry for the US and the Soviet Union. Without the veto to protect their interests, the major powers would never have joined the organization in the first place. All UN authority derives from its charter, divided primarily into Chapters 6 and 7. Chapter 6 mandates the pacific settlement of disputes through negotiation and diplomacy. Chapter 7 allows economic sanctions and military force, but a strict legal firewall prevents action without P5 consent. Because the permanent members used their veto to block almost all Chapter 7 actions during the Cold War, the UN was legally paralyzed and forced to find a workaround. Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld developed an ad hoc doctrine to bypass this gridlock. He called it Chapter 6.5, deploying neutral military observers with the consent of the warring parties. It occupied the space between passive diplomacy and active combat. This concept has grown into a $2.5 billion enterprise, with roughly 70,000 personnel deployed in missions across the globe. While the United States provides nearly 28% of the funding for these missions, the actual troops are provided by countries like India, Nepal, and Rwanda. This adaptation allowed the UN to maintain a security presence on the ground, even when the original 1945 blueprint was frozen by Security Council vetoes. With military intervention restricted, the UN expanded its influence horizontally into non-military domains that do not require Security Council approval. The Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, serves as the hub for this network, coordinating dozens of specialized agencies, funds, and programs. Agencies like the WHO and FAO operate independently to set global standards, fight diseases, and manage food security without direct oversight from the Security Council. UN funds like UNICEF and the World Food Programme focus on immediate humanitarian relief, turning the UN's abstract mandates into physical logistics on the ground. The funding for this ecosystem is distinct from the core UN budget. The core budget covers basic administrative operations and is capped at $3.45 billion. The specialized agencies and funds, however, manage between $15 and $20 billion annually, powered almost entirely by voluntary contributions from donor nations. The vast majority of the UN's practical labor and financial resources operate within this decentralized network, independently of the high-stakes politics in New York. Without ways to align the efforts of its 150,000 global staff and autonomous agencies, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, adopted in 2015, serve as the operating matrix for the entire UN system. These goals are completely non-binding. They rely on voluntary national implementation and peer pressure between states to drive progress. In India, the government has localized these goals into domestic programs like the Jal Jeevan mission, scaling water access to millions while championing the interests of the global south. Progress is currently struggling. As of 2024, only about 15% of the SDG targets are on track to be met by the 2030 deadline. The SDGs coordinate global survival through voluntary alignment and peer review, moving the institution away from the era of top-down command. We can evaluate the UN's utility by mapping its architecture against real-world results on this coordinate plane. There is high efficacy in domains where states recognize a clear mutual benefit, such as telecommunications, global health standards, and poverty reduction. Efficacy is lowest where great powers demand absolute sovereignty, specifically in the areas of geopolitical conflict and direct warfare. The 1945 architecture was built to manage conflicts between nation-states. But today's threats, from AI to climate change, do not respect national borders. Reform initiatives like the G4 bid for council expansion and the Liechtenstein Veto initiative are attempts to update this aging framework. The 2024 Pact for the Future, championed by Secretary General Antonio Guterres, is the latest attempt to modernize the institution's capabilities. Ultimately, the UN is a tool of its members. It can only be as effective as the political will of the most powerful states allows it to be. Despite its structural paralysis, the United Nations remains the only universal forum we have for international law. It must be reformed, because a world without it is fundamentally unthinkable.